You ever buy something and regret it almost immediately? I did. It happened on a gray, wet afternoon when I was driving home from work. I spotted a garage sale sign on the side of the road, the kind scrawled in thick black marker, barely legible. Normally, I wouldn't have stopped, but something about that sagging little house at the edge of town made me curious. The place looked abandoned, the kind of house where the windows always seemed dark, no matter the time of day. A few tables were set up in the yard, covered with junk, rusted tools, chipped porcelain dolls, old VHS tapes with no labels. And there, slumped in a dusty rocking chair, was him. A life-sized ragdoll, shaped like a man. His cloth body was yellowed with age. His button eyes, one black and one a dull, cloudy white, were barely hanging on by a few frayed threads. His stitched mouth curved into a grin that might have been friendly once, but now just looked wrong. Hell of a thing, I muttered, mostly to myself. The old woman running the sale turned her head sharply, like she hadn't noticed me approach. She was tiny, barely 5 feet tall, with brittle white hair and a face lined with too many years. When she saw what I was looking at, she pursed her lips. "He came with the house," she said. Her voice was dry and brittle, like dead leaves rustling. "You can take him for free." "A free creepy doll?" "Sold." I stuffed him into my trunk, which was harder than you'd think. His arms flopped around like a dead animal's. And I drove home. I lived alone in a small rental on the outskirts of town. The kind of place where the wind howls through the trees at night and the power flickers for no reason. I put the ragged man in the corner of my living room, still in his rocking chair. That night, as I sat watching TV, I heard a soft creak. The chair. Rocking. I turned my head slowly. The ragged man sat there, still and silent, but I swear his head had moved. Just slightly. I laughed it off. "Old house," I muttered. "Drafts." But when I woke up the next morning, something was different. His mouth. The stitches had split wider, like someone had tugged at them in the night. They curled outward, giving him a gaping, jagged smile. I convinced myself I hadn't noticed it before. Maybe the stitching was already loose. Maybe I was imagining things. By the third night, I started hearing whispers. Soft, faint, coming from inside the doll. At first, I thought it was the wind, but the sound had a shape, a rhythm, like voices muttering just below the surface of hearing. The longer I listened, the clearer it became. "Not yet," one voice whispered. "Wait," said another. That night, I locked the ragged man in the hallway closet. At exactly 3:07 a.m., I woke up with a start. A heavy silence filled the house. The kind that makes your skin crawl. Then I heard it. A voice. Barely above a breath. "Don't move." My whole body locked up. My breath caught in my throat. I turned my head slowly, my pulse hammering in my ears. The closet door was open, and standing in my bedroom doorway was him. The ragged man. He was taller now. His arms were too long, his body stretched unnaturally. His button eyes gleamed in the darkness, and his split mouth hung open, gaping. I scrambled backward, kicking at the blankets, but before I could even scream, he moved. 1 second he was at the door. The next, he was right beside me. His fabric arms wrapped around me, pinning me down. He smelled like dust, like old cloth, like something that had been buried too long. I gasped, tried to fight, but everything went dark. I woke up in the rocking chair. The house was silent. Morning light streamed through the windows. For a moment, I thought it had been a dream. A nightmare. But when I stood up, something felt wrong. I was stiff. Heavy. My limbs didn't move right. A cold pit formed in my stomach. Slowly, I walked to the mirror. And I wasn't me anymore. Button eyes. A stitched mouth. My skin wasn't skin. It was fabric sewn together in uneven patches. My hands were stuffed with old rags. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Then behind me, he stepped into view, wearing my face. He grinned at me, my grin, my lips stretching over my teeth. His eyes, now real, now human, glinted in the morning light. I raised one hand. He raised his. No, he wasn't copying me. He was me. And I was him. I stumbled back, my stuffed, useless limbs barely obeying me. He just smiled, adjusting the collar of my shirt. "Thanks," he said, and his voice was mine. "I'll take it from here." Then he turned and walked out the door. I ran after him, or tried to. But my legs didn't move right. My stitches pulled, my stuffing shifted. I tripped. Fell. By the time I got to the window, he was gone. I screamed, but all that came out was a dry, muffled whisper. I was trapped, stuck inside this body. And worst of all, I could still hear him. His voice inside me, laughing, whispering, and I knew the truth. I wasn't the first, and I wouldn't be the last. You ever pick something up and feel like it picked you first? That's how it was with the mirror. It was a gray Saturday afternoon when I found it, drizzling just enough to make the world look washed out and tired. I had no real reason to be out, but I'd been driving aimlessly, trying to shake a headache that had been gnawing at the back of my skull for days. The garage sale was a last-second stop. One of those roadside setups where people spread their old lives across folding tables, hoping strangers will pay a few bucks to take their burdens away. I wandered through mismatched coffee mugs, old VHS tapes with peeling labels, stacks of paperbacks that smelled like basements. Then I saw it, an old full-length mirror. The frame was wooden, painted black, its edges worn from time. The glass itself was clean, too clean, like it had been replaced recently. Something about it made my stomach knot up, but I reached for it anyway. The man running the sale noticed. Thin guy, hollow cheeks, eyes like two burnt-out coals. He saw me looking and shook his head. "You don't want that," he muttered. I raised an eyebrow. "Then why's it for sale?" He rubbed his jaw aside. $20. Cheap. Too cheap for something that looked antique. I pulled out my wallet. His hand shot out and grabbed my wrist. His fingers were ice cold. "Listen to me," he said, leaning in. His breath smelled stale, like he hadn't eaten in days. "It only shows what it remembers." I laughed. "What does that mean?" He let go, looking away. "You'll see." That should have been my cue to walk away. But I didn't. That night, I set the mirror up in my bedroom. I stood in front of it, studying my reflection. Same old me. Tired eyes, messy hair, a couple of pounds I kept promising myself I'd lose. The glass had a strange sharpness to it, like it was seeing me too clearly. As I brushed my teeth, I noticed something off. My reflection looked younger. Not by much, but enough to feel wrong. The kind of wrong that makes your skin prickle. And the bathroom behind me, it looked different. The wallpaper seemed a shade lighter. The tile had a faint floral pattern I didn't recognize. I blinked. It was normal again. I shook my head, muttered something about needing more sleep, and went to bed. But I dreamed of whispers. The next night, it got worse. I stood in front of the mirror, brushing my teeth again, when I noticed her. A woman. She stood behind me, just at the edge of the reflection. She was thin, almost too thin, with hollow cheeks and dark eyes that looked sunken in. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. She wore a long, white nightgown that swayed slightly, like there was a breeze. I turned around instantly. Nothing. My heart pounded as I turned back to the mirror. She was gone. I told myself it was a trick of the light, a glitch in my tired brain. But deep down I knew better. The next few nights, the mirror showed me things I had never seen before. One night it was a man. He was hunched over, dragging something heavy across a wooden floor. His arms strained, veins bulging in his neck. I couldn't see what he was pulling at first. Then the object rolled over. A body. Face down, limp, long brown hair covering the features. I backed away from the mirror, while rising in my throat. The night after that, I saw a child. A little girl, no more than 6. She was hiding under a bed, her small hands clamped over her mouth. Her eyes were wide with terror. Shadows moved across the floor in front of her, pacing, slow and deliberate. I felt something in my chest tighten. I turned around. Nothing was there. But the air was heavy, like something had just left the room. Another night, I saw a face. Not mine. Not anyone I knew. It was half-rotted, stitched together, with empty sockets where the eyes should have been. It was watching me. Waiting. I couldn't sleep anymore. I covered the mirror with a sheet, but it didn't help. I still felt it. Still heard it. And the dreams. They got worse. Then last night, the mirror changed. It stopped showing the past. It started showing the future. My future. I was lying in bed, the covers pulled up to my chest. My breathing was slow, steady. Then, a shadow moved in the corner. A tall, thin figure stepped into view. Its hands were wrong. Too long. too many fingers. And in one of them, a knife. I watched as the thing crept toward my sleeping reflection. It raised the blade, and paused. Then slowly it turned its head, and looked directly at me. I stumbled backward. The reflection flickered. My breath caught in my throat. Then my reflection's eyes snapped open. It blinked. I didn't. And then, the thing in the mirror smiled. Now I'm sitting here, in front of the mirror. It's almost midnight. The sheet is back on, but I know it doesn't matter. I can still feel it watching me. I know what's going to happen. The mirror remembers. And tonight, so will I. It started with a garage sale. A stupid, boring garage sale on a Sunday afternoon. The kind where people dump their old lives onto plastic folding tables and hope someone will pay a couple of bucks to take their junk away. I wasn't even looking for anything. I had just been driving aimlessly, killing time, when I saw the sign, garage sale. Everything must go. I almost kept driving. I should have kept driving. Instead, I pulled over. The yard was a mess. Boxes half opened, clothes draped over chairs, old dishes stacked in crates. A tired-looking woman sat in a lawn chair by the front door. She had deep purple circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept in a month. I wandered through the junk, pretending to browse. That's when I saw it. An old-fashioned baby monitor. The kind with a bulky plastic speaker and an extendable antenna. Yellowed with age, a crack running through the speaker. Something about it nagged at me. I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The woman noticed. She sat up a little straighter. "You want it?" she asked. Her voice was hoarse, like she'd been screaming recently. I hesitated. "Does it still work?" She licked her lips, nodded quickly. "Yeah, it works." Then, almost in a whisper, she added, "Just don't turn it on at night." That should have been enough to send me walking. Instead, I asked, "How much?" She shook her head. "Just take it." That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the baby monitor. I don't know why I plugged it in. Curiosity, maybe. Some weird, stupid part of me wanted to see if it worked. The small green light flickered to life. A soft crackle came from the speaker. I should have turned it off right then. But I didn't. Because that's when I heard the voice. Tiny. Trembling. A child's voice. "Mommy." My whole body stiffened. The voice was barely above a whisper, but I heard it clear as day. I swallowed hard. A hello. Silence. Then, "Mommy, he's here." I shot up from the bed, my heart hammering. The static deepened like the frequency had shifted. The child's voice came again. "He's in my room." I snatched the monitor and turned the dial off. The green light faded. Silence. I let out a shaky breath, forcing a laugh. Signal interference. That's all it was. But then, a deep breath came through the speaker. Even though I had turned it off, a voice followed. Not the child's. Something deeper. Something wrong. "She can hear us." I threw the monitor across the room. It hit the wall and shattered. Silence. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then I heard it again. The whispering. I turned slowly. The closet door was open. I don't remember leaving the bed. I just remember standing there, staring at the darkness inside the closet. I know I had closed it earlier. I know I had. The whispering was coming from inside. Soft, distant voices, like a conversation taking place at the end of a long hallway. I told myself to move. To grab my keys, get in my car, and never come back. Instead, I stepped forward. The floorboards creaked under my weight. The whispering stopped. I reached out with a shaking hand. The moment my fingers touched the door, it slammed shut. I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. Then, something scratched against the inside of the door. A slow, deliberate scrape, like nails dragging over wood. A child's laughter followed. Soft, giggling. And then, the closet door began to buckle outward, like something was pressing against it from the inside. I ran. I didn't look back. I bolted down the hallway, nearly tripping over my own feet. I reached the front door, yanked it open, and sprinted outside. The night air was thick, suffocating. My car was parked at the curb. My hands fumbled for my keys. I got inside and locked the doors. My breathing was ragged. I sat there for what felt like forever, staring at my house, waiting for something, anything, to move. But nothing did. Nothing except the baby monitor. It was sitting on the passenger seat, perfectly intact. The little green light was still on, and from the speaker a voice whispered, "You shouldn't have left her alone." I checked into a motel that night, didn't go back home, didn't even go near the neighborhood. I barely slept. By morning, I had convinced myself that I had imagined most of it, that maybe I had fallen asleep and had some kind of bizarre nightmare. Then my phone buzzed. A notification from my security camera app. I hesitated before tapping it open. The footage loaded. It was my bedroom. My bed was still unmade, the sheets tangled from my panicked escape. The closet door was shut. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Then, the closet door opened. Not swung. Opened. Slowly. Deliberately. Something stepped out. I couldn't see it. Not clearly. But the shape was wrong. Thin. Too tall. Limbs that stretched in ways they shouldn't. It crawled across the floor, moving toward the baby monitor. Then, just before the footage cut out, it turned and looked directly at the camera. I don't go back to that house. I don't even drive past that street anymore. I left everything behind. My clothes. My furniture. Everything. Because sometimes things don't just stay in houses. Sometimes they follow you. And sometimes, even when you think you're alone, a little green light flickers on. Garage sale. Not the kind you see in rich neighborhoods with barely used cappuccino machines and designer purses going for $10. No, this was the other kind. A sagging two-story house with paint peeling like old sunburnt skin. A front yard full of things people should have thrown away, but for some reason couldn't. Rusting tools. Stained furniture. Dolls missing eyes. And the dress. It wasn't hanging on a rack with the other clothes. It was displayed separately, draped over the back of an old rocking chair like some sacred relic. Ivory lace. Tiny pearl buttons. The kind of old-world beauty you didn't see anymore. The moment I saw it, I wanted it. I wasn't engaged. Hell, I wasn't even dating anyone. My love life was deader than roadkill on a summer highway. But something about that dress called to me. I reached out, letting my fingers brush the delicate fabric. Cold. Like it had been left outside on a frosty morning. "You like it?" The woman running the sale was standing behind me. She looked drained. Hollow-cheeked, with deep, sleepless circles under her eyes. Her lips were dry and cracked, like she hadn't had a sip of water in days. "She never made it to the altar," she said. Something in her voice made my stomach tighten. "She?" I asked. The woman swallowed. Her gaze flicked to the dress. "My sister." A pause. Then softer. "She loved that dress." I should have asked what happened. I should have walked away. Instead, I asked, "How much?" The woman exhaled slowly, like she'd been holding her breath. $50. I handed over the cash. And that was my first mistake. I brought the dress home and hung it on my bedroom door. Somehow, stuffing it into my closet felt wrong, like locking something alive in a box. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept looking at it. Even in the dim glow of my nightstand lamp, the lace seemed almost luminescent, like it was breathing. Sometime around 2 a.m., I finally turned over, forcing myself to face the wall. Then, a sound. A soft, shifting rustle, like fabric sliding over wood. I held my breath. Maybe I imagined it. Then, another sound. A sob. Low. Mournful. Coming from inside the dress. I turned my head, just a little, just enough to see. The dress had moved. It wasn't hanging anymore. It was standing, like someone was wearing it. And beneath the veil, through the intricate lace, a face. Rotting. Lips peeled back from blackened teeth. Skin sagging like wet paper, flesh peeling in places, exposing bone. And her eyes. Hollow. Black. Staring. My breath hitched in my throat. Then, the dress took a step forward. The air turned freezing. My breath plumed in the darkness. The fabric whispered as it moved. I tried to scream. Tried to move. But I was frozen. Then, a whisper. Not mine. You took my place. The veil rose like something beneath it was breathing in. Something cold and boneless touched my wrist. And then, darkness. I woke up gasping. Sunlight streamed through my window. For a moment, I thought a dream. Until I looked in the mirror. I wasn't wearing my pajamas. I was wearing the dress. Perfectly fitted. The pearl buttons fastened all the way up to my throat. The lace hugged my skin like a second layer of flesh. I let out a shaking breath, hands trembling as I reached for the zipper. I tried to pull it down. It wouldn't budge. The dress held me. Then, a whisper. From the mirror. My reflection blinked. And I didn't. The breath fled my lungs. I wasn't in the mirror anymore. Something else was. She was. The rotting bride. Her lips moved. Now you understand. Her hands reached through the glass. I turned to run, and felt her pull me back in. I woke up in the dress again. But this time, I wasn't in my room. I was somewhere else. The world around me was wrong, dim and gray, like an old photograph left to rot in a flooded basement. I turned, and there she was, standing in front of me. No veil this time. Just black eyes, a ruined face, and a mouth that never fully closed, whispering words that never ended. You took my place. Now you understand. The air thickened. My lungs strained. Then I saw it. A mirror standing alone in the gray. I ran to it, and I saw myself, standing in my bedroom, eyes wide, mouth open in a silent scream. But I wasn't moving. Something else was. She was. She turned my head. She smiled with my mouth. Then she turned and walked out of the bedroom, wearing my skin. I pounded on the glass. No one heard me. The mirror darkened. The world faded. And I understood. She hadn't just wanted her dress back. She wanted a body, a life, a second chance. And I had given it to her. The next weekend, there was another garage sale. A woman in her 30s walked through, absently browsing. She wasn't looking for anything in particular. Then she saw it. The lace wedding dress. A perfect fit. It hung over the door, glowing in the dim sunlight. She reached for it. And the seller, a woman with tired, haunted eyes, gave a small, weary smile. "You have good taste," she murmured. And when the woman asked how much, she simply whispered, $50. I first noticed the puzzle on a dusty garage sale table, its antique wooden box standing out among piles of old books and forgotten trinkets. The box was labeled "Complete the Picture" in faded, ornate letters. I remember the old man running the sale, a wiry fellow with a crooked smile and eyes that twinkled with secret mischief, smirking as I handed over my cash. Something about his expression made me feel that I was accepting more than just a piece of discarded memorabilia. Back home, I carefully opened the box. The pieces were oddly heavy, each one carved with intricate details, as if they had been cut from a faded photograph long ago. I spread them out on my coffee table and began assembling them out of habit and genuine curiosity. At first, the picture was just a jumble of colors and shapes, but slowly a scene emerged. A house with weathered walls, a dimly lit room, and in one window a vague figure. The scene was eerie yet mesmerizing, drawing me deeper into its mystery. Piece by piece, the figure in the window began to take form. At first, it was nothing more than a shadow, a dark blur that contrasted with the softer background of the room. But as I placed more pieces, the outline of a man became visible. His features were indistinct at first, a hint of a mustache, a pair of eyes that seemed hollow. I found myself leaning closer, compelled by a mix of fascination and an inexplicable dread. The more pieces I connected, the more the image evolved. The man in the window started to look directly at me. I swear that as I placed a piece near his face, his eyes appeared to shift, as if he were glancing over his shoulder. It was subtle, a trick of the light, I told myself, but it sent a chill up my spine. I began to notice details that I hadn't expected. The dim room behind him was filled with shadows, and his expression, once neutral, had twisted into a grin that stretched too wide, too unnaturally. Night after night, I returned to the puzzle. It was like an obsession I couldn't shake off. I spent hours fitting the pieces together, and each time, the man in the window seemed to get closer, his features more defined and his smile more sinister. I couldn't tell if I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. It was as if the puzzle was not just an image, but a portal, drawing me into a secret and unsettling world. One evening, as I reached for what was to be the final piece, my hand hesitated. The rest of the puzzle was complete, and the picture seemed almost alive, a dimly lit house with a figure whose eyes seemed to bore right through me. My heart pounded in my chest as I held the last piece between my fingers, wondering if it was even wise to complete the picture. My mind was racing with questions. Who was this man? Why did his grin seem to mock me? What did it mean that he appeared to be stepping out of the frame? Just then, I heard the soft creak of my bedroom door opening. I turned slowly, a cold sweat breaking out along my arms. In the silence that followed, a whisper brushed against my ear, a soft, sibilant command. Finish it. The voice was not mine. It was low, almost pleading, and it seemed to echo around the room. I froze, the last puzzle piece still in my grasp, my body unwilling to move as I tried to process the sound. The whisper sent a shiver down my spine, and I felt as though I were standing at the edge of a precipice, caught between the rational and the supernatural. The room was dark, the only light coming from a single street lamp outside that cast eerie shadows on the walls. The man in the picture, now almost fully formed, seemed to beckon me with that unearthly smile. My mind screamed to run, but my feet remained rooted to the spot. The puzzle lay before me like an open invitation to complete something I knew I should never finish. Slowly, trembling, I set the final piece into place. In that moment, the silence in the room shattered. A strange gust of wind swept through the apartment, rattling the windows and plunging the room into a deep, oppressive cold. The image in the puzzle appeared to pulse, and for a fleeting moment, it felt as if the man was no longer confined to the picture. His eyes, now disturbingly clear, seemed to look directly at me. I could almost swear I heard his voice, a low murmur that blended with the echo of that earlier whisper, urging me on, daring me to confront whatever lay hidden within the completed picture. I stepped back from the table, my heart hammering, as the room slowly returned to its stillness. The finality of the puzzle piece in place felt both like a relief and a curse. I had completed the picture, but I knew that something had been unleashed. That simple act of assembly had drawn me into a web of secrets and whispers, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the man in the window was now a part of my world, watching, waiting, and perhaps even coming closer. I sat in the dark, alone with my thoughts, and wondered if some puzzles were meant to remain unsolved. I found the unmarked VHS tape at a dusty garage sale, hidden beneath a pile of old magazines and broken trinkets. The seller barely looked at me as he mumbled, "Take it. Just don't watch it alone." I had a strange feeling about his words, but curiosity got the better of me. Once home, I couldn't resist the urge. I slid the tape into my old VCR, despite the chill creeping up my spine. The TV burst to life with a burst of static. After a few tense moments, an old home video appeared, a grainy recording of a family gathered in a cozy living room. The mother smiled softly, the father chuckled warmly, and a small child sat between them, eyes bright with innocent joy. Their laughter and gentle chatter filled the room, and for a brief moment, the scene seemed almost comforting. But then, at exactly 1:07 a.m., something changed. In the midst of their laughter, every one of them stopped moving. It was as if time itself had frozen. The smile on the mother's face halted mid-laugh, the father's eyes locked in a static grin, and the child's playful expression turned into a blank stare. The entire room fell silent. The camera panned slowly, lingering on a worn-out couch. Then, in a shocking twist, the family was gone. Only the empty couch remained, except for one horrifying detail. The television in the video was still playing, and on its flickering screen, I saw a living room almost identical to my own. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized that on the screen, I was sitting on my couch. I blinked, convinced that my mind was playing tricks on me, but when I looked back at the screen, the image was clear. I was there, and behind me, looming in the dim light of the video, stood the family. Their presence was silent and unnerving as they stared, unblinking, from the background. I tried to shut off the VCR, to rip the tape out and end the nightmare, but nothing worked. The remote control lay dead in my trembling hand, and the TV continued its sinister display. The screen showed me from an angle I had never seen before, as if someone was filming my every move. My body grew cold, and I felt trapped in a vortex of fear. The warning of "don't watch it alone" now echoed in my mind, a phrase that chilled me to my core. I recalled a story my grandmother once told me about a cursed family doomed to haunt those who dared to disturb their final moments. I had laughed it off as a ghost story meant to scare children. Now, alone in my darkened living room, I was forced to believe that the tape was more than just an old recording. It was a portal, a trap set by something that wished to cross over from the past. The room began to feel unnaturally heavy, as if an unseen force was closing in on me. The static on the screen shifted, and a series of faint whispers filled the silence. They were soft at first, like a gentle breeze, but soon grew into an eerie chorus that repeated my name over and over. I felt as if unseen hands were brushing against my skin, cold and insistent. The family in the video, now emerging as shadowy figures behind me, seemed to stretch their limbs toward me. Their eyes, dark and unyielding, held a promise of eternal waiting. I tried to move, to run, but fear had gripped me so tightly that my body felt paralyzed. Every second that ticked by deepened the dread in my heart. I could see the family's ghostly outlines growing more distinct with each passing moment, their expressions blank yet filled with a quiet malice. I wondered if they were the lost souls my grandmother had spoken of, condemned to exist in a world between life and death. And now, it seemed, I was being invited to join them. A sudden flash on the TV sent a shock through me. The screen now displayed a new message, its red letters stark against the dark background. Welcome home. It was as if the tape was not only watching me, but inviting me into its twisted narrative. I felt a desperate urge to escape, to break free of the invisible bonds that held me captive in that living room. I reached for my phone to call for help, but the device was dead, its screen as lifeless as the shadows that now filled my space. The scene on the tape began to morph, the living room in the video transforming into a surreal landscape of shifting images. The happy family had been replaced by a series of ghostly apparitions, their features distorted and their movements jerky. It was no longer clear whether I was watching a recording or witnessing something unfolding in real time. I looked around, and the room behind me seemed to mirror the eerie happenings on the screen. The whispering grew louder, and the faces in the shadows drew nearer. In that frozen moment, I realized that the tape had not been a simple recording. It was a trap designed to capture a soul. The family in the video, once lost to time, were now watching me with a hunger that I could not comprehend. Their presence, once confined to the flickering images of an old home video, had breached the barrier between the past and my present. I was caught in a limbo, a ghostly observer in my own home, waiting for the moment when I too would vanish. As the final words on the screen faded, I was left with the unbearable truth. I was not alone. The family was there, in the shadows, silently waiting for me to become part of their eternal, haunting tale. And with that realization, I understood the terrible price of my curiosity. I had invited the darkness into my life, and now there was no escape. At a small, quiet garage sale on a gray autumn afternoon, I found it, a delicate music box that caught my eye like a secret waiting to be told. Its carved wooden exterior was faded from years of neglect, yet there was an elegance in its design that made it seem almost otherworldly. The tune it played was slow and haunting, even as I watched the seller wind it up for a demonstration. The woman selling it, her eyes brimming with a mix of sorrow and relief, leaned in close and said in a soft, trembling voice, "I'm glad you're taking it. It always arranges itself." I hesitated only a moment before paying a few dollars and tucking the box under my arm. That night, back in my small apartment, curiosity got the better of my lingering doubts. I set the music box on my bedside table and carefully turned the key to wind it up. As the gentle, eerie melody began to play, it filled the room with a sound that was both sweet and sorrowful. Just as I settled into bed, something unusual happened. A soft, childlike laughter echoed through the darkness. It was faint, as if coming from far away, but unmistakably real. I froze, listening intently, and then, as quickly as it had begun, the laughter stopped. I couldn't decide whether to dismiss it as my imagination or to feel deeply unnerved. I shut the music box off, hoping that silence would return. But silence was not the end of it. The very next night, I awoke to the sound of that same haunting melody playing on its own. I sat up in bed, heart pounding, as I strained to listen. The music was gentle yet insistent, wrapping the room in its spectral embrace. Then I noticed something impossible, a trail of tiny footprints in the dust that led directly from the door to the edge of my bed. The footprints were delicate, almost childlike, and they vanished at the foot of my bed as if the child had simply disappeared into thin air. Trembling, I examined the prints, trying to understand what I was seeing. The rational part of me insisted they were nothing more than dust blown by the night wind. Yet deep down, a creeping dread whispered that something supernatural was at work. In the pale morning light, I made a decision. I couldn't live with the constant terror that crept into my nights. I grabbed the music box, placed it in a garbage bag, and threw it away, hoping to rid myself of its haunting melody and the mysterious laughter that seemed to follow. For a few days, I tried to convince myself that the ordeal was over. I tried to return to normal life, dismissing the incidents as a series of coincidences and overactive imagination. But then, on one particularly cold and sleepless night, I awoke around 3 a.m. to a sound that made my blood run cold. There it was, the same slow, mournful tune, playing softly yet clearly in the darkness. I sat up in my bed, straining to locate the source. At first, it seemed to be coming from somewhere in the room, but then I heard it again, a distinct, rhythmic melody coming from beneath my bed. I lay frozen, every instinct screaming for me to run, yet my body felt paralyzed. The thought that something was hiding under my bed was unbearable. I reached out with trembling fingers, sliding my hand slowly under the edge of the bed. My skin prickled as I felt something soft, a presence I couldn't explain. I pulled my hand back as if burned, my mind racing with terror. The music, so gentle yet so unnerving, seemed to mock me, as if whatever was under my bed was inviting me to come closer. I decided then that there was no escaping the terror that had invaded my life. In a desperate bid for safety, I called a friend, a skeptic by nature, and explained everything. But when I returned to my apartment later that day, I found no evidence of the footprints or the mysterious presence under the bed. The music box was gone, the night's nightmare seemingly washed away by daylight. Yet every time night fell, the melody returned, and with it, a faint echo of a child's laughter that haunted the quiet hours. Now each night, I lie awake, waiting for that haunting tune to begin again. I have sealed off the space under my bed, desperate to block out whatever lurks there, but the music always finds a way. The gentle melody, the echo of laughter, and those tiny footprints serve as constant reminders that some things, once invited in, refuse to be banished. I still wonder about the woman's strange words at the garage sale. It always arranges itself. Perhaps the music box arranged my fate, drawing something from the darkness into my life. And every time the clock strikes 3 a.m., I know that something is calling me from under my bed, a chilling invitation I can never truly escape. I was wandering through a quiet yard sale on a crisp autumn afternoon when I saw it, a miniature, handcrafted Victorian dollhouse, tucked away on a rickety table. Its tiny details, from the delicate lace curtains to the hand-painted wallpaper, spoke of a time long past. An old woman, her eyes cloudy with memories, leaned in close and said in a whisper, "It arranges itself." Her words sent a shiver down my spine, but my curiosity was too strong to resist. I bought the dollhouse and carried it home, unaware that I was taking more than just an antique. That night, after I had set the dollhouse on my desk in the living room, I settled into bed with a sense of unease I couldn't explain. The soft glow of a street lamp outside cast long shadows across the room. I tried to dismiss the old woman's words as idle talk, yet sleep eluded me. A few hours later, I awoke to a faint rustling sound. In the dim light of the early morning, I crept back to the living room and noticed something strange. The tiny chairs in the dollhouse had shifted positions, and the little doors that once sat closed were now slightly ajar, as if someone or something had been there, rearranging everything. I stared at the dollhouse in disbelief. I had been the only one home, and yet it was as if the miniature house was alive. The more I looked, the more I realized that the layout of the dollhouse now mirrored the layout of my own apartment. Every room, every piece of furniture, even the position of the tiny windows, matched mine exactly. A creeping feeling of dread settled in my stomach as I realized that this was no ordinary dollhouse. As the morning light grew stronger, I noticed a new addition inside the tiny rooms. A small, intricately carved bed in one of the miniature bedrooms. On that bed lay a tiny figure, perfectly posed as if in a deep sleep. I leaned in closer, my heart thumping in my ears. The little figure was disturbingly lifelike. It looked just like me. Its delicate features, the way its tiny hair was combed, and even the posture it held seemed to mirror my own. I couldn't tear my eyes away. In a moment that felt both surreal and horrifying, the tiny figure's eyes blinked. I froze. My mind raced with impossible thoughts. Had I really brought something into my home? Was the dollhouse not only alive but somehow connected to me? I felt as if I were trapped in one of those eerie stories I used to read as a kid, where the line between the real and the unreal blurred into terror. Trying to regain control, I stepped back from the table and shook my head, convincing myself that I was merely tired and overthinking things. But then I sensed movement behind me. I turned slowly, expecting to see a stray pet or a trick of the light, but found nothing. Yet, the feeling of being watched clung to me like a heavy blanket. Every shadow in the room seemed to hold a secret. Every creak of the floorboard whispered that I was not alone. Over the next few days, I became obsessed with the dollhouse. Every morning, I found small changes. Chairs slightly moved from their previous positions, doors that swung open as if inviting unseen guests, and tiny objects that I couldn't remember being there before. The layout remained a perfect replica of my apartment, and each change filled me with an escalating sense of dread. It was as if the dollhouse was mapping out my every move, echoing my life in its miniature world. Then, one quiet evening, as I sat reading in the living room, I glanced over at the dollhouse. To my shock, the tiny figure that resembled me was no longer lying in the bed. It was sitting upright at a miniature desk, its head tilted as if deep in thought. I leaned closer, compelled by a mix of fascination and terror. In that instant, the tiny figure's eyes blinked once again, slow and deliberate, and I felt as if it was trying to speak to me without words. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that the dollhouse was no longer just a silent object on my table. It had become a window into a parallel world, one that reflected my life with eerie accuracy. And then I heard it, a soft creak from behind me, as if someone had stepped into the room. I whipped around, but the space behind me was empty. Still, I could feel a presence lingering in the darkness, watching. Every night since then, I've been haunted by the same feeling. I try to ignore it, to convince myself that it's just my imagination, but deep down I know the truth. The dollhouse is a doorway, a link between my reality and something much older, something that lives in the shadows of the past. Its tiny, detailed rooms mirror my apartment not by chance, but by design, a design that is now entwined with my own existence. I have since stopped sleeping in my apartment, and I keep the dollhouse locked away in a box. But sometimes, in the stillness of the night, I swear I can hear the soft sound of tiny footsteps and the gentle click of miniature furniture being rearranged. And sometimes, if I dare to look into a mirror, I see a reflection that isn't quite my own, a reflection that mimics the movements of that tiny blinking figure. I learned the hard way that some things should remain untouched. The dollhouse, with its uncanny ability to arrange itself, brought with it a presence that I can't explain. A presence that mirrors my life and haunts my every step. If you ever find a handcrafted Victorian dollhouse at a yard sale, remember the old woman's words. It arranges itself. And then heed the warning and run, before it arranges a version of your life that you can never escape. I found the antique typewriter at a dusty garage sale, tucked away between old books and forgotten trinkets. Its worn keys and faded ribbon spoke of a long, mysterious past. The seller leaned in and whispered, "It still works. It writes what it wants." His words sent a chill down my spine, but I couldn't resist its strange allure. I paid a few dollars, tucked it under my arm, and carried it home. That night, in my small apartment filled with the soft hum of rain against the window, I set the typewriter on my desk. The lamp's warm light made the room feel safe, yet there was an odd energy in the air that I couldn't quite place. I sat down, hesitating for a moment as I ran my fingers over the keys. Their surface was cool and smooth, a stark contrast to the trembling anticipation building inside me. At first, nothing happened. I pressed a few keys and listened for the familiar clack, but there was only silence. I loaded a fresh sheet of paper into the carriage, expecting to type a few words to test it out. But as soon as I did, the keys began to move on their own, tapping out a rhythm that was both deliberate and eerie. Slowly, a single sentence appeared on the paper. "I see you." My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the words. I hadn't touched the keys, and yet there they were, bold and accusatory. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the steady patter of rain. An icy dread crept over me, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. Determined to break the unsettling spell, I reached over and unplugged the lamp, plunging the room into darkness. I thought that would stop whatever was happening. But the typewriter kept clacking, its sound echoing in the stillness. Then another sentence appeared. "Behind you." I froze. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes darting through the shadows for any sign of movement. The room was empty. There was nothing behind me except the lingering echo of that ominous message. I rushed back to the desk, only to find that the paper I'd been reading from was now completely blank, as if the words had been erased. My mind raced. Had I imagined it? Was it a prank? But the relentless tapping continued, and soon a final, chilling line emerged. "Look in the mirror." I swallowed hard. The mirror on my wall, hanging just behind the desk, beckoned me. With trembling steps, I moved toward it. In the dim light of the street lamp filtering through the window, I stared at my own reflection. Then, in a moment that defied all reason, I saw my reflection begin to move independently. Its eyes locked with mine, and with a slow, deliberate motion, the reflection reached out and mimicked typing on an invisible keyboard. I backed away, heart hammering. The sight was impossible, a doppelganger that seemed to act on its own accord, producing words I couldn't quite see. The room, which had seemed safe moments ago, now felt like a trap. A heavy, unseen force pressed down on me, as if the typewriter's eerie command had opened a door I couldn't close. I tried to shake off the terror, convincing myself that it was just a trick of the light, a figment of an overactive imagination. But every time I glanced in the mirror, I saw that ghostly figure, its hand hovering over an invisible set of keys. I couldn't help but feel that something was wrong. Something ancient and malevolent had been awakened by the typewriter's strange powers. In the days that followed, I attempted to ignore the typewriter, hoping that time would erase its inexplicable influence. I even tried to remove it from my apartment, but each morning, it would reappear on my desk, as if it were bound to me by an unseen tether. I began to hear soft, rhythmic tapping at odd hours, and when I checked, no matter where I looked, the typewriter was there waiting. The message from that first night haunted me, echoing in my mind. I was being watched, and something was using me to send its cryptic warnings. Late one night, desperate and sleepless, I sat before the typewriter again, watching it in terror as the keys moved by themselves. The room grew colder, and the shadows deepened, coalescing into vague, human shapes behind me. I realized with dawning horror that I was not alone. The typewriter was more than an inanimate object. It was a portal to something dark, a whisper from a realm where time and logic no longer applied. With every passing moment, I felt my grip on reality slipping away. My reflection in the mirror continued its silent, menacing typing, producing words that I could neither read nor comprehend. I wondered if I had become trapped in a ghost story of my own making, a tale of horror that no one would believe. The typewriter was writing a narrative of terror around me, one line at a time, and I was helpless to stop it. In that cold, oppressive darkness, I realized that I was caught in a sinister dance with a force that wrote its own fate. The final, unyielding truth was this: I was no longer in control of my own story. The typewriter had claimed me, and soon, I feared, I would vanish from the reflection in the mirror, replaced by a shadowy figure forever trapped in its cursed narrative. And so, every night, as the keys clack in the silence and my reflection types away, I live with the lingering dread of the final line that has yet to be written. I found the old Polaroid camera at a local garage sale on a chilly fall afternoon. I wasn't looking for anything special that day, just a few odd trinkets to decorate my cramped apartment. But there it was, a battered vintage camera with a faded label and worn-out edges that somehow called out to me. The seller, a gaunt man with tired eyes, didn't even ask for money. Instead, he shoved it into my hands, muttering, "Take it." His voice was low, almost a whisper, and his eyes held a secret I couldn't quite read. That night, back in my empty living room, I decided to test it out. The apartment was silent except for the hum of the refrigerator, the dim light from a single lamp casting long, uncertain shadows. I set the camera on the coffee table and aimed it at the room's far corner, a place that had always felt a bit off, as if something were waiting there. With a hesitant click, I pressed the button and watched the flash burst across the room. I waited, heart thumping, as the instant film began its slow, mysterious development. When the photo was finally ready, I pulled it out with trembling fingers. There, in the dim background of my living room, stood a man. He was nearly hidden by the shadows, but I could make out his gaunt face, hollow eyes, and a smile that didn't reach them. It was as if he were watching me. I stared at the photo in disbelief, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of light or an odd quirk of the old camera. I told myself it wasn't real. Yet something inside me urged me to take another shot. I set the camera up again, repositioning it slightly to capture more of the room. With another click, the flash went off. This time, when the picture developed, the man was noticeably closer. His features were sharper, his eyes fixed on the scene, as though he were moving toward me. A cold shiver ran down my spine. My mind raced with possibilities. Had I unwittingly captured a ghost, or was it some cruel optical illusion of the old camera? Unable to shake the feeling of dread, I took a third picture. I tried to steady my shaking hands, desperate for proof, or perhaps for closure. The camera clicked once more, and as the film slowly revealed its image, I gasped. The man was right behind me in the photograph. His face, gaunt and spectral, was inches away from where I stood. It felt as if he were reaching out, his cold presence looming over me. The room suddenly felt claustrophobic, the shadows more menacing. In a surge of terror, I dropped the camera and bolted from the room, my heart pounding as if it would burst right out of my chest. I spent a sleepless night in my apartment, every creak and whisper amplifying my anxiety. I could not escape the images burned into my memory, the slow, relentless advance of that faceless watcher until he stood directly behind me. I kept thinking about the strange, silent way he appeared in each successive shot, as if the camera itself was drawing him closer with every click. It was a haunting puzzle I couldn't piece together, one that left me feeling vulnerable and exposed. The next morning, still shaking from the night's events, I made my way to the kitchen for a cup of coffee. As I opened the cupboard, I froze. There, sitting on the table in plain view, was another Polaroid photograph. My hands trembled as I picked it up. It was a close-up shot of my own face, taken without my knowledge. But that wasn't all. Resting on my shoulder in the picture was a hand that was not mine, pale, with slender fingers and nails neatly trimmed. The hand looked almost ghost-like, and it seemed to belong to the same man from the earlier photos. I backed away slowly, my eyes locked on the image. How could this be? I hadn't taken that picture, and yet it was as if the camera was following me, capturing moments I never lived. The rational part of my mind struggled to deny what I was seeing, but deep down, I knew that something unnatural was at work. The old man's strange behavior at the sale, his silent insistence that I take the camera, now made a twisted sort of sense. In the following days, I tried to discard the camera, convinced that if I could destroy it, I might break the hold it had over me. I tossed it into a garbage bag and took it to the curb, yet when I returned home later that day, the camera was back on my doorstep, as if it had never left. I began to avoid my apartment altogether, staying in a friend's place, but even there, I could not shake the feeling of being watched. Every reflective surface hinted at that pale hand. Every shadow seemed to hide a silent observer. I tried to call the authorities to seek help for what I believed was a curse or a malevolent spirit, but no one could explain the relentless sequence of events. It was as if the camera had become a conduit, a dark portal linking me to something beyond our world. Every time I glanced at a mirror or caught a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, I thought I saw that ghostly hand reaching out. Now, I live in constant dread of the next click, the next photograph that might reveal even more. The Polaroid camera has woven itself into my life, capturing images that are both proof and a threat. I cannot escape the feeling that with every photo taken, I am drawing closer to an unseen fate. A fate that has already been written in the silent, eerie language of that cursed camera. I lie awake at night, haunted by the thought that one day, I might not be able to outrun what the camera has captured. A dark presence that will follow me until there is nothing left but a final, chilling photograph.